Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this session today. The title of today's webinar is PeopleSoft Role Management, Reduce Complexity and Optimize for Compliance. Our presenter today is Greg Wendt, who will introduce himself in just a moment. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. But first, before we continue, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming from your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 45 minutes. There will be a Q&A session following this presentation, so please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for our speakers to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Greg.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Stephanie. So as she said, my name is Greg Wendt. I'm an executive director here at Pathlock. I've been in and around the security market for, on the vendor side, for about the last almost 8.5, coming up on 9 years. Before that, I was enterprise architect of numerous different organizations. So I've worked a lot on the customer side. So when we're talking about some of the challenges that we're working with today of really roles and SODs and, how do we do these things effectively and user access reviews, those are all different challenges that I've worked with throughout my career, doing and supporting that. One of the definite things that I learned a lot of was dealing with audit reports and signing off on what the pros and cons, and yes, do we have our mitigations in place? Are they not? Is it just it is what it is kind of type of answer, those types of things. So we'll be discussing several or a lot of that today. So that's just a brief introduction to me. Also a brief introduction to Pathlock and who we are. Pathlock, we really merged about 7 different companies here recently, and with that, it's given us the ability to do many different things that we weren't able to do before. One of our big areas with this is we have the ability to really integrate with multiple different applications. It allows us to have that communication flow and communicate directly into those applications to understand what is somebody's roles and permissions inside of Target A or Target B or Target C. This could be SAP, PeopleSoft, EBS, JD Edwards, Salesforce, Active Directory, any of those different types of application sets. Because really, when you're looking and thinking about what their roles are, they have permissions all across your organization. So we can resolve single and cross application SOD issues from a single panel. That's what those integrations really allow us to do, is communicate to all of these different application sets. I'm not going to go through all of the rest of this stuff. You guys can read the slides as well as I can, but it's really the fact that through these integrations, we have those touch points, which gives us the knowledge to be able to understand, hey, what does this user have? What is this user able to do? And should they be able to do all of those things? And what does my risk look like because they have access to those particular features and functions? So Pathlock really is the market leading unified access orchestration platform out there, with some of our customers here and also some of our partners. Once again, not going to go into all of those. So let's talk about some of the different challenges that we're having now. When we think about disconnected processes and really systems that are critical for improving compliance and controls, I'm going to go ahead and build out this slide. Think about all of the different applications right there in the middle. You've got cross application controls. What are you going to do with your ERP systems? What are you going to do with AD? How are you going to control access to all of these transaction controls? What do we mean by transaction controls? Should somebody be able to access this transaction? Should we implement multi-factor? Is it ABAC? Is it RBAC controls? Which ones are we using for somebody to be able to access these? And when we have access design and certifications, how often are we doing those? User access reviews. Is it something that we're going to do monthly, quarterly, yearly? Depends upon the group. And then you layer in all of the other processes that are going on outside of those disconnected audit processes. Only getting small sample group testing when we're looking at SOD violations. How are we understanding exactly what type of risks that we're having across all of our applications? Because maybe they are disconnected applications and they're disconnected approval groups and silos inside of all of these. So when you have, you think about how the threats are approaching these application stacks and how you're trying to control that access, whether it's a cyber attack or an insider threat, it really boils down to my mechanisms for catching them are all the same. I have to put in the same controls for, trying to prevent a cyber attack as I do from an insider threat. The difference is, how do I really tell from an insider threat what's super valid access, or was that somebody overstepping their bounds? That's why insider threats are so difficult to catch, because it really is that small, minute understanding of A and B. Was A correct and B now invalid? Those types of things. I was an enterprise architect for 20 plus years. All of my job, I can tell you, I never should have been able to access private information on an employee. Why? It's not part of the job. No point would I ever have to do that. Same things with vendors, or, dealing with payroll or dealing with financials or expenses, not part of the job. So why do some of these admin level accounts have carte blanche access to everything? Always a big audit flag that I had to deal with. So, it really boils down to some of the previous ways to manage roles and access. Typically a lot of organizations really just kind of did grant everything, especially to admins. Well, that's the way it works. Well, just because, giving full access to some account, of course, everything's going to work that way, but that doesn't necessarily make sense. So we think about, when you're onboarding people and going through the process flow there, how long does it take to actually onboard a person into your environment so that they can actually have the access that they need? That slow onboarding process is one of the issues that most end users have. And the reason why is because talking with multiple different organizations, they can really have a new employee that might sit for a week, 10 days, 14 days, 20 days, 30 days. There's some organizations that really can have a new employee sit for 30 days. That's extremely unproductive and extremely costly to the organization. But you think about why. There's a lot of processes involved, manual processes and communication. Okay, it has to go from HR. Well, we hired this person. This is what we hired them for. So that's going to go to this particular manager. Now we've got to get them access and controls. We need to get them a PC. We need to get them a Mac, whatever it is. But all of these different things have to go through, and there's a multitude of stakeholders. And anytime that you have lots of different people involved with the process, you're going to have tedious reviews. And when you're dealing with multiple different stakeholders, what is their priority? They're not the person that probably hired this person. So it's just more work for them to do. And that's where a lot of the bottlenecks come in, because it's misaligned resources and really human error. So that's some of the previous ways to manage risks in our roles and access, because it really is something that's taken an army of people to do in a lot of scenarios, and it's manually driven. So it's coming from spreadsheets. The sample testing, when we look at it on the old way, if you're really looking at all of the transactions that are happening inside of your system, you could get a great view of what your risk is. How many of you are really looking at a sample set of 100%? None. Maybe not none, but there's probably not a lot. It gets down to the perspective of it. A lot of it boils down to, well, a consultant or an auditor caught that. We're not, finding out what's happening in our own, world. And that's really because there's disparate, disconnected tools. Not everybody speaks the same language. Not everybody's looking for the same thing. Not everybody gets paid for finding the exact same risks, for example. You look at, you talk about individuals inside of this, life cycle management of what's happening here. What is their job? What do they get paid for? When you're talking about a manager who owns the system or who has a bunch of people working, they're not getting paid to really understand the risks. They're getting paid for either, how many expenses were approved or denied, what happened from that flow of the business that they have to support. So really boils down to having or aligning all of those resources and having those silos between the apps and teams. They don't communicate in a way that they can understand what the other groups are doing as well. And a manager may have somebody who has access to Salesforce. It could be PeopleSoft, it could be SAP, it could be JD Edwards, it could be EBS. They could have a plethora of different access points all the way across all of those, for example. So that becomes a different challenge as to, how am I going to work with this and what am I going to do with it and who should be involved from the process flow of all of this. So it really boils down to, how do I manage that? How do I keep that within a breadbox that really makes sense? So here at Pathlock, we really have a different way. We focus on the data security, and that's where our governance and approach focuses, because it allows us to look at it and say, all right, from a data security perspective, what are controls that we can put into place and what makes sense? Also, what's happening inside of the system. So for example, we have fine-grained access analysis and provisioning capabilities, into 140 plus business applications. That allows us to actually have a centralized policy management across those systems to where we can actually say, hey, look, an event occurred in one of these PeopleSoft systems that needs to affect what this user has over in these other systems. They changed their job. Maybe they were onboarded, maybe they moved. If you want to talk about the joiner, leaver, mover process, which we'll go into a little bit more later, but that's really what's happening, is we can have that access analysis of what those users are doing based upon business events. A deep transactional inspection of can do and did do. That can do, think about it from a role. This is what I've given the access to my users to do, period. That's what they can do. But really, how do you quantify that if you don't understand what they did do? And I'll go into more details later, but did do is the transactional level, knowing and understanding what they're touching and what they're working with on a daily basis. And then we also integrate deeply into the system. So you can see some of the pros and cons of some of the other IGA providers out there comparative to us. But the big walk away is really, here at Pathlock, what we do is we focus on the data security and understanding that data level to give you what your risks are really going to look like. When we take a step back, a manual role cleanup processes have always been a constraint. How many people, I was kind of talking about this a little bit earlier with somebody, but it's like, raise your hand and be like, yes, I love doing these. No, nobody really loves doing role reviews, and nobody wants to redesign your entire security of the system. It's almost like an entire re-implementation. You may have thousands and thousands of roles in your system, literally. Why? Because you're not going to utilize any of the PeopleSoft delivered ones because they're too risky and they may change when you're taking PUM updates or situations like that. So you don't want to deliver, you don't want to use those. So you're going to create all of your own. So you're already duplicating a lot of effort of work there, which is completely understandable. So now we think about provisioning. How much effort is required to provision or deprovision a user? A lot. Going through that process. That's why the onboarding process alone can take, in some scenarios up to 30 days or longer for some organizations. What about when we talk about movers, moving between job A and job B? What's efficient? What should it be? What are you going to do with from a provisioning perspective when they do move to a new job? Do they still get their controls or their authorizations in the other system as well? Or should they get, should they have both for a time being? Well, who's going to do that? Is it manual? Is it system? What about when somebody leaves the organization? Do they still need access to W-2 for financial and tax reporting? Or do they lose access to that as well? So do they have a little bit of portal access or a little bit of HCM access to be able to access those types of things? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Is that automated? Is it manual? How are all of those cleaned up after time? So lots of questions when you're talking about provisioning and deprovisioning users. When we talk about the effort needed to execute user access reviews, kind of depends upon where you sit as an organization. The user access review process is typically very tedious. Normally it's working with spreadsheets and emails, and they go back and forth between the product owners or the managers and their particular constituents. And they're very siloed. So I'm going to do that in HCM, or I'm going to do that in financials, or what other application stack that I might be working with at that moment in time. So it really boils down to, how do I do this and what makes sense? How often do I do the user access reviews? Talking to some clients here lately and possible customers, there's been a shift, I think, really been a shift in that. And I don't know if it's based upon some of the new compliance challenges that are out there, or really internal audit with, or an external audit for these organizations. But when you talk about high privileged users specifically, there really is it seems to be a driving force to actually go through user access reviews monthly, which that's quick. And if you're not doing some sort of automated process flow there, it can become a real big challenge. And then also how much effort is needed to enforce SOD, and are you even doing SOD? Some organizations, it's like they've kind of thrown their hands up. Well, we threw it over to the business. They're going to do it. Whose responsibility is it? Is it technical? Is it functional? Is it the business owner? Is it an auditor? Is it risk? Whose job is SOD? And who's going to implement it? Who's going to control it? Who's going to watch it? What's going to happen with it? Right now you're probably, if you haven't implemented it, you're probably doing some sort of small sample testing. Well, what is your sample testing? 1 to 2 to 3, 5% of maybe the transactions that you're doing. So what are the chances that you're actually going to catch an SOD violation inside of there? So it really boils down to people, processes, and technology. And all of them have to enable the former. They have to work together in an effective manner that makes your organization more efficient and protected. You want to lower your risk, and all of those have to work together to be able to do that. So improving PeopleSoft periodic role cleanups with automation. Automation allows you to do a lot more with less, much more with less. But one of the important features of that is you have to utilize the power of technology to help. There's got to be analytics, there's got to be algorithms, and you've got to streamline your GRC strategies. So when you're talking about automated provisioning, if you silo off any one of these items just to do on their own, I'm going to automate provisioning. Not going to do anything with my roles, for example. Not going to touch them. Does that make you more efficient? Yeah, maybe it does. But what would it do? It can also just continue to expand the issues that you have as an organization from your role design. If I'm continuing to give users bad roles, what's that going to do from SOD? It's going to make it worse, right? Because now all of a sudden I could be, provisioning roles that these particular users really don't need, or those roles are creating toxic combinations to allow authorizations to allow SODs. That wouldn't be good, now would it? So that's where you've got to really think about all of these boxes holistically together. We want to automate provisioning, yes, but we need to do that with SOD integrated into it, and also user access reviews. All of those are pieces that are very important to be able to tie back to that automated provisioning. Emergency access management. What that is allowing you, firefighter style access to where I need break glass. Somebody's got to go fix something. That was always one of the things I got dinged with on an audit report, for example, because I had, the highest level access into the system, and it becomes very difficult to track. Some of the, PeopleSoft doesn't do a good job of, 4 people may have access to the PeopleSoft admin account. Who logged in? Who did what? How do I differentiate between Greg and Jimmy and Sally and Susie? I don't know. That's the problem with it. And do I even have the detailed logging that is required to differentiate it? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Most likely it's probably a don't, or it's 50% or something like that. So that's why all of those things become very important, and you have to look at them holistically. Individually, if you're just solving part of the problem without including the rest, you're probably coming up with a flawed design. So really, what Pathlock allows you to do is secure your users' applications, data, and prove it to the world. Because you can secure your apps, but if you can't fundamentally show and be able to respond to an audit that you have secured your applications, then how effective are you being? Really is what that boils down to. We do this multiple different ways. We're going to start with connections into the applications, whether that's your ERP system, your cloud legacy, all of those different situations. We have touch points. That's where it goes back to, Pathlock has all of these integrations. Those are those touch points. That's important. because what it does is it allows us to see that can do in all of those different systems. That's where your user access reviews come in, your access analysis, access management, emergency access. All of those things are, governing user access and those controls. So can do, the big part about can do that you've got to remember is this is what the authorizations give this user to do. They can do X, Y, and Z. They can access this permission list, this role, this permission list, this page, for example. That's what they're able to do. When we talk about did do, this is where you're getting into monitoring those business transactions. What does this do? This flips the coin. This is really a differentiator on can do versus did do, because did do will not only say, oh, Jimmy has the ability to do this access, but he did it. And here's what he did inside of the applications that utilizing that access. So that allows you to understand whether those segregation of duties were violated, whether it's a business process. It really boils into that whole different methodology of understanding Jimmy did X. Or maybe he didn't do, because there's, you got to look at the coin from both perspectives. Just because Jimmy had access to do X and he didn't do it, maybe then the question comes up on a user access review. If he hasn't used it, why does he even have that access? Maybe we should remove that access. So that's why it's important to understand did do. That's where most of the organizations, when they err on the side of, I don't want to make a mistake, this user needs to be able to do their job, I give them all the access under the sun. It's because they don't know what they did do. Because it's really difficult to understand the functionality required for that particular job. So having that did do allows you to tailor your access at a much different layer than just looking at it from a can do perspective. So big differentiator between those two. And when you have that did do analysis, what it allows you to do is quantify your risks. Ultimately, that's what the organization is concerned about. When you boil it up to the upper, high levels of the organization, auditors want to know, how do I quantify this? What am I going to do from a risk perspective? Does this affect my financial reporting? That's the level that they're worried about. That's where you get into that C-level suite. There's not a whole lot of people that are going to get promoted because they, did and gave access to 500 different people today. It's not about that. It's by prioritizing that impact and understanding, hey, maybe I didn't give somebody authorizations today because if I did, this is what the impact would have been, and that would have been a mistake from the organization. You'll probably get promoted because of understanding that, rather than just giving people access to things that they don't need access to on a daily basis. So that quantifying of risks ultimately puts it into business terminology. This allows a technology solution to provide business with what it needs to function and understand the risks of their organization as a whole. You have to do this all of the time. Really, all of these things have to work together in concert to be able to give you the correct vision of what's happening inside of your organization. So let's talk briefly about really the access governance lifecycle. And this is when we step back and look at what needs to happen with a user and with access controls and role design and user access reviews and role reviews and all of those other types of things. All of this is happening all of the time. You start with a role. Well, because how can I provision and deprovision automatically if I don't have a role to give to that user, right? So it really starts and lives and breathes at that role level. When we think about a role, since our system sits outside and communicates across multiple different application sets, it allows you to maybe build design roles at more of a holistic scope. So where I can have a business function role that might have the access to PeopleSoft. Maybe it's HCM, maybe it's financials, but then it might be Salesforce. There's also what's required for Active Directory, those types of things. So it really allows you to build a role that defines what this user needs across my applications and across my organization to be able to function to do their job. You can also have very tactical roles. Those tactical roles allow you to say, oh, they're going to be able to do X in PeopleSoft, Y in Salesforce, Z in Active Directory. those, obviously they can get very tactical, but you can also look at them and build them in with the design of, here is my scope. So what that does is it allows people who are looking at it from a risk perspective to understand, all of a sudden now the silos get busted down. Now you can see user A's got access in 3 different systems. And maybe it was the access in the other system that is now causing the problem within the PeopleSoft system, for example. So, but when you have the roles and that process is finally done and controlled, then you can provision and deprovision, because you got to make sure that you really provide clean roles to be able to provision and deprovision. If you're, that's why I go back to that other slide where if I'm provisioning and deprovisioning, but I'm just slapping in roles that aren't clean, or, that maybe have SOD violations within them, what am I going to do? I'm actually, making the problem worse in the end. So you want to make sure that your processes and your roles are clean so that you can go into that provisioning and deprovisioning process. And then also you're going to have access requests that come in. How are you going to deal with those? Where are you going to deal with those? Where is that request coming from? Is it coming from an employee? Is it, privileged access management? Maybe it's an automated request to where it's completely all system level automation. It all depends upon where it's coming from, is what type of review it should have, and maybe what type of approvals it should have through that process flow. So then you have the user access reviews. This is the process that, depending upon who that user is and what they have access to, maybe it's something that's done monthly to quarterly, or maybe it's every 6 months to a year. If you're dealing with somebody who's maybe just a very standard self-service user that doesn't have any high privileged access, how frequently do you need to do a user access review with that? That's a system that you can automate very easily, and it can take care of a large set of your users into the system, for example. So, those reviews are going to be periodic. They're going to be based on the time frame that's important for you, probably dictated by audit, is my guess moving forward. And then when we talk about these last 3, I like to group these together from the perspective of when we look at an SOD, one, how are we implementing that SOD rule set? Where are we implementing that rule set, and how are we checking and validating it? Because that's going to dictate what our sample testing is. If we don't have a system that's got the SOD audits built into it, then you're basically taking a swag at all of this, because you're going to have some sort of sample testing, might be 3 to 5% of your overall transactions, and you're going to do your violation management based upon what you find out of those 3 to 5%. You're not doing a holistic check on your data sets to be able to understand exactly what your full risks are. Why? Because you don't have access to it. Once again, probably the differentiating factor here in the SOD audits and the sample testing is the did do. Going back to that life cycle, it's the did do. This is taking the can do and applying the did do in an effective manner to be able to quantify the real risks that your organization has. So with that, let's do a quick demo here. So I am going to grab one of my browser sessions here, and we are going to close out. Let's do this, and we'll do a new window, and we're going to log into one of my systems here. So let's go there real quick. And what I want to do is I'm going to log in and talk a little bit about some of these particular process flows and what we're doing inside of the system, and how can we connect these things to make sense. Going back to that life cycle, thinking holistically about that life cycle, it really is about roles, users, automation, SOD, and tying and building all of those things together. So what I'm going to look at here real quick to start with is, and I clicked too many times there, so we're going to look at the SODs. So when you look at understanding an SOD, this is really a rule set built in. And just real quick, and this is a system that's outside of the PeopleSoft. So if you're familiar with what we've built from the Appsian past, this was we have a lot of connections through our application security platform that's within PeopleSoft. So this is outside of PeopleSoft. So these rules are built, and once you have all of your SODs built and defined, what that does is it allows us to understand what's happening inside of the system. So we can actually look at a dashboard and we can see, so let's grab like FSCM, we'll grab PeopleSoft and I'll display here. We'll see what we find. So we can see that we've got several different role level risks. Here are some of the risks by schema. What are my user risks inside of those? Do we have any SOD violations that have occurred inside of the system? The answer is yes, we do. Also top roles, some of those types of things. So we've got, through those dashboards, we can actually see what's going on. And what we do is we actually have an SOD rule set that is a starter point. Is it going to be 100% of your particular SODs? Probably not. But what it does is it allows you to get a start on that. Because the important part is once I have an SOD rule set, now I can actually get into my review process, and I can also understand my provisioning and deprovisioning and some of those types of things, because it's going to be very different between those different ideas. Because if I go into an access review, for example, when I look at a role and designing those, or comparing what users have, I'm going to start with a review process. So I'm kind of looking at this from a self-service perspective, and I'll actually jump in and show more from another side in just a little bit. But when we do this self-service side, we really have the ability to select the user groups. What people do I want to look at? Do I want to look at high privilege? Do I want to look at certain roles? What do I want to do? But then also, one of the things that I want to call out here is what systems do I want to do this for? So we have the ability to compare this across different applications within your system. What this does is it's going to allow you to have one review across all of those, so it's less touches to the end user is actually doing this user access review, to allow them to focus on what's important. So now you can have that it's a high privileged user across multiple different systems. So I could say financials, PeopleSoft, HCM, for example. I can run that, and I can see what these users are going to have. You can customize whatever you want in your email, and then you can run the process. The nice part about it is once that process is run, I'm going to switch over to more of a manager view. Now I can look at the campaigns, the processes that have been run for me, for example. So if I look at the PeopleSoft role process and what needs to be done and reviewed, that's going to load up. I can pick and choose my users. So I'm going to look at Marie here, or Nicole, and I can see what roles she has. She has this one role inside of the system. Maybe I can approve or reject that right there. Nice part about it is, from that perspective, if I reject it, we can automate the removal of that right then and there. So it goes out and cleans that up. Somebody doesn't have to come up, a security administrator doesn't have to come in after the fact and say, oh, that's what I need to do in this scenario. I need to step through all of these jumps. We can also see the usage percentage. Hasn't used any activities with that. So should she even have this role? How long was that since the last review? Now it starts to bring into those questions as to what the importance is and how frequently that needs to happen. If I look at Vicky's in here, for example, obviously Vicky's going to have more, but we can see which activities she's utilized and what, the roles that she's actually used, what that role description is. I can approve or deny it, so I can see, her pivot grids she didn't use. Now I know, because this is that did do of the understanding of, now I could actually remove this from this user, this authorization, because they didn't utilize it. They didn't do it. Now, is that a risky behavior? It's far less risky because of the fact of not having to, by knowing that this user hasn't utilized it, why should they have those authorizations, for example? So maybe they need to request them when they get to a point where they need to have this access again. You can drill in down further layers if you want at that side of it to get into what the activity is. Basically think about this from the perspective of role levels. So this is all the way down into the inside of the role. We have the permission, and inside of there is the page and component level. So you can actually see what people have access to. once again, we can see if it's never been used or if it has been used, the activities, those types of things. So it allows you to dial that in and really understand what's happening inside of your system while you're doing those role reviews. This all comes down to a self-service user, so it's not something that, from that particular perspective, they're not having to tie in a bunch of other users. They're not having to come back to the business owner. They're not having to come back to the security administrator or PeopleSoft administrator and say, hey, can you run this report for me? Can you pull all of this information for me so I can have access to this, because I don't know what this person's done or not? No, now I'm in it. I'm dealing with the system. I can understand what, Gmiles is actually accessed, and I can look at it and I can either approve or deny it right then and there. So it really makes the job of the reviews much easier. This is an entirely automated process flow. The nice part about it is, from the perspective of how often does that occur, that's how you define your campaigns. So maybe you have those sample groups, of your high privileged users. Maybe they are done every month, 6 weeks, quarterly. However, what your requirements are, you can easily set that up. On the first part of, if you're doing it quarterly, first day of the quarter, boom, the process is going to happen for you automatically. You don't have to remember to go in and run something or do something from that process flow. It's going to take care of it for you. So it's really important from the review perspective and understanding, and taking away authorizations and those types of things. You can also understand where the review process sits. So if I were to look at the review and process that, we can actually see, what's been done, what the username is, if any sort of authorizations, how many activities are in a role, for example, all of those types of things. So it really allows us to close that loop even further. So a lot of this I've been showing you more from a self-service perspective, to where it allows me, to understand from an end user, what am I accessing inside of the system, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go over to look at it a little bit different way, and I'm going to log in more from an administrative back office type of options, to where I have more controls here. So I'm going to look at some of the reports. I'm going to look at, let's look at access. So if I look at some of the roles, so I'm going to look at role content, since we're talking about roles here. So let's grab, I'm going to grab a role here. Let's look at the system administrator role. So I'm in PeopleSoft FSCM. So I'm just going to copy that one real quick, and I'm going to do a quick display here. Inside of here, obviously there's going to be, all right, so let's display this. All right. Let's clear out of that one. Let's grab a different one. Not sure if my system just all of a sudden had a problem, because it was showing me some of this before. All right, there we go. So just grabbing one. So like a salesperson, what type of activities do they have? We can see that each one of their activities kind of functionality rolls down as to what they're doing inside of the system. When we look at it, risks, they don't have any risks for this, which is why, part of the reason why I wanted to look at that system administrator one, because it is one of the roles that really already comes with a few different SOD violations with it. Let's go back to, let's refresh this. Don't think that wanted to refresh. I don't think, yep. I don't think that it really wanted to play nice with that that one large role for a second. So log back in here real quick. So, looking at it and understanding where people have access. So we can look at it from the employee profile. Let me grab an employee here. Let's do a, so I'm just gonna open up this user. I don't know, honestly, looking at the system, if this user has access to PeopleSoft or other systems. So, but the nice part about it is that's actually one of the reasons why I'm opening up this user, is because it's understanding what this user has within the system across all of your organization stack. So it really gives you that complete view and it wants to respond slow. So I'm going to grab a drink of water. All right. But what we would end up seeing here, if this wants to come in, is it's going to give us the view of what this employee has and that understanding of different application sets that they're going to work with, different authorizations inside of each one of those application sets, and really give you that complete picture. This is, when you're viewing your organization is very siloed. So this is a payroll administrator, so I can go to his activities. We can see the system, Oracle eBusiness, we've got SAP. As I said, I wasn't sure if this user was, PeopleSoft Financials, they do have it. So these are all of the different activities that this particular user can do. That's a lot of activities. So when I'm looking at a role designer, this particular user, asking for new roles inside of a system, I can see they've got Active Directory, Informatics, eBusiness Suite. They have a ton of access inside of our system. So it really allows me to see that. And then we also have risks. What are their risks? Because of the roles that this particular user has across all of my application sets, for example, here's some of the combinations that could be toxic or concern for the organization as a whole. So now when they, make a request of, I need access in PeopleSoft HCM to do X, well, what else do they have? How do I understand that the role that they're requesting isn't something that's going to cause a problem? This is where you can look at that employee profile, you can look at the roles, and you can understand holistically, this is what this user has inside of my system, and should they or should they not have access to that? That becomes way more effective from an organizational flow. It allows you to really understand your risks as to what this end user has. And that's really where it boils down to, defining your roles and your authorizations. That's ultimately what it's about, is controlling levels of risks from the organization flow to be able to keep those to a minimum. So that's just something I wanted to show you there. So let's switch back over to the PowerPoint here. I think we're doing okay on time, but I want to make sure we get to questions and those types of things as well. So this is a cost-effective solution as well, and you can tailor it to meet your needs. When we talk about provisioning or deprovisioning, I didn't really show that today. I can automate it. I can show it to you, especially out of PeopleSoft. We've got automation of provisioning really on the mover side, but you can do it at either the joiner, leaver, mover process, and it allows you to have that user access across applications defined and built based upon a business event inside of PeopleSoft. The nice part about it is tying in that audit and SOD, having your rules or your roles validated against an SOD allows you to verify that you're not giving users invalid roles that they shouldn't have, that are going to create additional security risks or authorization risks for your organization. So that's how it controls fraud and really prevents fraud, because it happens and the user, the security administrator, the business owner who's authorizing that can tell that up front. So it's not something that you have to wait till after the fact. So it allows you to be very proactive through there rather than reactive, which is going to, simplify your other access reviews. It's going to clean them up. The more access reviews you go through, the cleaner and cleaner your roles are going to get, the cleaner your users are going to get, the better and more efficient your provisioning is going to be, and the more secure and less risk is going to be involved inside of your system. You can also manage RBAC or ABAC controls as well to reduce your costs and really implement additional security controls through that process flow as well. So you can streamline and automate the PeopleSoft role management process through multiple different ways by, identifying and rectifying those SOD conflicts in minutes. It allows you to see those up front. It's important to know and understand what are your risks in the process flow. You don't want to wait until after the process is actually finished, and because then you're finding it through sample testing at that particular point. And sample testing is not that efficient. For one, you're going to have a lot of false positives. If you're finding and understanding what your roles are doing in the beginning beforehand, it's going to allow you to be far more targeted on the back end. That's why that's a whole life cycle management of the provisioning process there, and understanding that whole life cycle management of the roles and reviews and user access policies all together. So it also allows you to unlock efficiencies in provisioning and role management, because the cleaner your roles are, the more effective your provisioning can be. And really, if you've got very good roles and good provisioning, you can think about, you can really probably automate 85 to 90% of your access requests. If you think about a lot of them, onboarding, for example, I'm going to onboard employees. Let's say I'm in a retail organization, and you go through the example of how many people do you hire and fire for Christmas. There's some organizations that are going to hire 10,000 people and fire them between now and January. That's a lot of people, but you also have to go through the correct onboarding process, right? Because they still need to get paid. They still need to have access to self-service. They might need access to W-2s for long-term. So that means being able to, provide that information for another year. Are they going to be inside of your identity management system? Are you going to implement them with single sign-on? How are you going to do all of that for those, 10,000 retail employees? When you can do this through these processes, it allows you to automate those all. Reminds you to make it turnkey. Somebody's not having to physically go do that. They're not having to come up with spreadsheets and track all of these things. Typically, a lot of those users would not be synchronized to your identity store, for example. So it allows you to really have that same process flow for everybody within your organization, so they all have access to the same applications, everything that they need to do their job, but it's also compliant, streamlined, and it minimizes the amount of risk. It also takes out the human error, so it can happen very, very quickly. If need be, through those automated processes, you can have approvals put into the steps as well. Those are all very easily done. So you can perform your access reviews in hours, not weeks, because as you saw, you can pull them up, you can understand what users have accessed, what they've seen, what they've done. That's that did do. That did do allows you to really validate and understand whether somebody is utilizing the access that they have or not, for number one, to make it very easy to go through those reviews. But it also really dials into exactly what that user is doing to understand. So that's some of the advantages of streamlining and automating your PeopleSoft role process. So with that, I will hand it back to Stephanie.
Thank you, Greg, for that presentation. Again, if you have any questions, please add them now into the question box. And while we're waiting for those, I'll just go over a few announcements. Our next webinar for PeopleSoft coming up is integrating small SSO and MFA for seamless and secure PeopleSoft authentication. And that will be Wednesday, October 19th at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And with that, we have a couple questions. The first question is, what is the implementation timeline?
The implementation timeline is actually relatively quick. Since this exists outside of your PeopleSoft system, what we're able to do is tie in through a feed to see what the user's authorizations are in your PeopleSoft system, pull that into our PathLock system, and then immediately start running reviews so you can start comparing it. Obviously, I stated earlier that we kind of have a start for a deliverable on a SOD rule set. So it would be combining those risks. Obviously, it would be something from your organization. You would have to tweak that SOD rule set for your organization, but at least you could start to get turnkey user access reviews in a very short period of time. The automation of those user access reviews is all built into the system as well. So many of the features you can get implemented very, very quickly.
Okay, great. And our next question is, what technical implementation effort is required?
What technical? So from that perspective, it would involve, there is a an installation of the product. We also have a cloud version of it as well, but there's connectors that have to be built in to set up to allow us to communicate with the PeopleSoft systems to actually pull information out. Once those connectors are done, the PathLog system pulls most of the information that it needs to then have in the system to pull and generate everything that it needs at that particular point. So once the system is set up, installed, and configured correctly, there's not a lot of technical resources that are needed for the administration of the product.
Perfect. Okay, that's all the questions that we have for today. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Greg, for your presentation. And we hope to see you at future webinar events.